So a very warm welcome to this afternoon's talk from our guest speaker Simon Miles. Peter Welsford, our chairman, can't be here today. He's not able to. He's a little bit immobile at the moment, but he sends his very good wishes. And it was he who persuaded Simon to give the talk. I'm standing in for Peter Welsford. I'm Susan McElroy. I do the administration. And traditionally, we, at this point, read out the objects of the society.
Over here? Okay. Among the objects for which the society is established, as expressed in the Memorandum of Association, are the following. To encourage, for the benefit of the public, the study of the works of Francis Bacon as philosopher, statesman and poet, also his character, genius and life, his influence on his own and succeeding times, and the tendencies and results of his writing. To encourage, for the benefit of the public, the general study of the evidence in favour of Francis Bacon's authorship of the plays commonly ascribed to Shakespeare, and to investigate his connection with other works of the Elizabethan period.
Okay, well, Peter sent me a little bit of information about Simon, and he tells me that Simon Miles and Walter Saunders, who's here all the way from Jersey, came to a talk at the University of London Senate House some years ago, and as a result of this, Simon became a member of the society and has given a talk. And another member said today that was the best talk she'd ever heard, right? So thank you, Simon. Peter says that when Simon came to see him at his house, he said, "Oh, you've got Foucault's pendulum." Is that how you say it?
Foucault's pendulum.
Foucault's pendulum. And you pointed that out. And of course, Peter absolutely loves books of that ilk. So that was very, very, very good. The talk then today is "When Shall We Laugh? Say When? Francis Bacon and the Merchant of Venice." And in this talk, Simon will explore the historical background and literary sources of the Merchant of Venice and present surprising new evidence pointing to Francis Bacon's authorship of the play. It follows from an earlier talk, which I mentioned, that he gave to the Society in 2009, in which he discussed the events surrounding the affair of the Dutch churchyard libel of 1593 and the connection to the first emergence of the names Marlowe and Shakespeare in relation to writing and the theatre. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Simon.
Thank you very much, Susan. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here today at the August Francis Bacon Society to present the talk. And in fact, the title has changed very slightly from the one that Susan read out. The name of my talk today is actually "When Shall We Laugh? Say When? Francis Bacon, Anthony Bacon, and the Merchant of Venice." Well, this is what I'm going to be talking about. This is the play of Merchant of Venice as it first appeared when it was first published in quarto form in 1600. And there's the cover as it appeared when it was printed. Written by W. Shakespeare, it says on the cover. Well, we're going to explore that a little this afternoon. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the play, The Merchant of Venice. It won't matter too much if you're not so familiar with it, but just to give a very, very brief overview, the main characters in the play are Antonio, Bassanio, Portia, and Shylock. Antonio and Bassanio are the two male leads. Portia is the love interest, shall we say, and Shylock, of course, is the very famous Jewish moneylender. The play really consists of three intertwined plots: the plot of the bond, the plot of the caskets, and the plot of the ring. Today we're really going to be focusing on the first aspect, the plot of the famous bond, the pound of flesh. But the play is really broader than that. The play, as far as I've come to understand it, it's not even really about Venice. It's a play, a much more universal play. It's a play about the tension between the local and the foreigner or the stranger or the other in the city. So in a sense it represents the encounter in cities all over the world between the local and those that have come into the city. So I've always had a curious feeling when I've watched The Merchant of Venice. The plots all come to a very nice conclusion at the end. All the loose ends are very nicely tied up by the playwright. But nevertheless, it's a play which leaves questions hanging in the air, or certainly that's the sense that I get. For example, why does Shylock want the pound of flesh? This is something we're going to explore a bit more in this afternoon's talk. He's asked several times during the play, why is it that you want the pound of flesh? And he deflects the question every single time with a non-answer. So if you're paying attention when you watch the play, when you leave at the end of the night, the question hasn't been answered by the playwright. It's left hanging in the air. But it's by no means the only question. The specific relationship between Antonio and Bassanio is also something that is not specifically spelled out by the play. Now, there's lots of ideas people have had, but we're going to explore that a bit this afternoon. At the very beginning of the play, Antonio, the character, speaks about his sadness, and the entire first scene is a discussion about why he is sad. Again, the answer is never really determined in the play, and it's left hanging. There are other subsidiary questions that are raised. Bassanio, who is the character who needs to borrow the money, it's never actually explained why. Well, we know why he wants to borrow the money, but we don't really know why he fell into debt in the first place. And finally, the standard question that every essay topic sets for Merchant of Venice is it a comedy or a tragedy? It takes its place in the comedies in the first folio, but it's difficult to see sometimes quite what makes it a comedy. It's because it's a very serious play, and so the question mark hangs over it as to why Shakespeare decided to characterise it amongst his comedies rather than the tragedies. So it's a play that leaves questions unanswered. But what I want to do this afternoon is explore what I've come to see as an invisible architecture or hidden scaffolding, if you like, behind this play. I've been thinking about this now for over 10 years, and in that time I've come to my understanding of the play. I've come to realise that there's all kinds of behind-the-scenes things that are going on which give the structure to what's actually played out on stage. I've come to think of this play as made up of a series of layers, and in a sense it's only the top layer that's made visible. So the talk this afternoon is going to be divided into two parts. In the first part, we're going to look at these layers and explore the layers and see how they combine to create the characters and the plot of the play. And then once we've laid out these layers, we're going to move to part two, in which we're going to go into a little bit more depth and to trace the sources, the textual sources that the author has used in putting together the materials that make up the play. So one of the plots in the play is the plot of the caskets, and for those of you that are familiar with the play, the suitors come to Portia and have to choose between a gold, a silver and a lead casket. And these caskets, the winning casket contains a likeness of Portia. And whoever chooses the correct casket and finds the likeness of Portia wins her hand. Well, I've come to understand that there is, as it were, a fourth casket, a secret casket hidden in this play. What we might even call an Easter egg in the common parlance. So an Easter egg, do you know what an Easter egg is? Of course, I'm not talking about the chocolate Easter eggs. An Easter egg has come to mean a hidden joke or a hidden game that people inject these days into video games or movies or other works of art that are designed to be hidden there by the author to reward the curious. So I've come to understand that Merchant of Venice has indeed such an Easter egg or hidden compartment. And this secret casket, when we can find it and we can open it with the correct key, reveals the true identity of the author. Part 1, the layers. Well, I've decided to start with this lovely quote of Francis Bacon's. If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties. So let's start today with a doubt. And what I'm going to doubt is a piece of accepted wisdom that has passed around Baconian circles for many years about this play. And it concerns an event where Francis Bacon was actually arrested himself for a debt. And it's been spoken on many occasions that there must be some connection between this arrest of Francis Bacon and the arrest of Antonio, which is at the heart of the Merchant of Venice. So let's have a look at that, and I want to explore that and show you that in fact it's absolutely impossible that Francis Bacon's arrest could have influenced the Merchant of Venice, and in a moment you'll see why. So Francis Bacon was arrested on September the 23rd, 1598. Throughout the 1590s, he was hopelessly in debt and constantly borrowing money. And on this occasion, he had borrowed money from a fellow called Giles Simpson, who was a goldsmith. He borrowed £300. Now, one day Bacon was involved with business for the Queen. He was part of a deputation that were interrogating a prisoner in the Tower. And as he was leaving the Tower on this day, September the 23rd, 1598, Giles Simpson had Bacon arrested for this debt. Now, in fact, there was still 2 weeks running on the debt. It wasn't actually due, but Giles Simpson decided to take this opportunity to have Francis Bacon arrested. And it got Francis in a bit of hot water. In fact, he could have quite easily been sent to the Fleet, but he was able to do some quick thinking, contact a friend of his, Sheriff Moore, whom he'd been dining with, and he was taken to a friend's house and he was able to send out a couple of letters to friends appealing for some money to get him out of this sticky situation. And the letters have survived. They weren't known for about 100 years, so at the time nobody knew about this, and there's no other information about this arrest except for these 2 letters. Well, the first of the letters he sent to Sir Thomas Egerton, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal. And I've got a couple of quotes from these letters. I'll read it out. I am to make humble complaint to your lordship of some hard dealing offered me by one Simpson, a goldsmith. For this Lombard, pardon me, I most humbly pray your lordship, if being admonished by the street he dwells in, I give him that name, having me in bond for £300 principal, and then he continued on with the letter. Well, I'm going to come back to this word Lombard in a moment. So he then continued and he made a specific complaint to Sir Thomas Egerton as to why Francis thought the arrest was unfair. And the reason he said was because he was arrested while he was on the way out from the Tower on Her Majesty's business. And Francis was putting the proposition that it was unfair to be arrested when he was going about Her Majesty's business because that was an insult to the Queen. So in the letter he said, as for contempt, he has offered, in regard to Her Majesty's service, to my understanding, carry a privilege, iuando et redundo, in meaner causes. Iuando et reduando, my Latin is nil, but I understand that means coming and going. So what he was saying is, because I was coming and going on Her Majesty's business, that takes precedence over lesser things like these small debts. He also wrote a second letter to Robert Cecil, Secretary of State, where he laid out pretty much the same information, and he made the same objection. Mr. Simpson might have had me every day in London, and therefore to belay me while he knew I came from the Tower about Her Majesty's special service was, to my understanding, very bold. So these were the specific complaints Francis made about being arrested. So now let's look at Merchant of Venice and the dates. Scholars seem to agree that it was written sometime between 1596 and mid-1598. Now we know mid-1598 is the terminal date because it was registered for publication in the Stationers' Register on July the 22nd of that year. So that was required in those days that every play or book be registered for approval. So this means that the play was certainly completed and written by July the 22nd, 1598. Some 3 months before Francis's arrest. The play was certainly performed in 1598. There's a book called Pallidus Tamia, or Wit's Treasury, in which the author names 6 Shakespeare plays which were known on the stage at that time, and Merchant of Venice is named as one of them. So although it wasn't published in quarto until 1600, we know for certain that the play existed in 1598 and was completed by July. So look at that, it's absolutely impossible that Francis's arrest could have influenced the writing of The Merchant of Venice. Nevertheless, it is very, very strange because the central plot of Merchant of Venice with the Bond is about a debt and being arrested, virtually the same circumstances. In fact, the amount of money is 3,000 ducats, so there's even a resonance there with the £300. So we have a doubt. Our beginning doubt is that Bacon's arrest could not possibly have influenced this play. So what's going on? Well, strangely enough, Francis did actually insert his arrest into another play, but it's not The Merchant of Venice. For this we need to turn to the play of Henry IV, Part 2. And in this play, the character of Falstaff is arrested for the non-payment of a debt for hospitality that he owed to a Mistress Quickly. Now in this case, the play of Henry IV, Part 2 has been dated to sometime between 1598 and mid to late 1559. In fact, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2 are considered to follow immediately on from Merchant of Venice. So that's very interesting already that the plays are connected in time. But let's have a closer look at that. In Act 2, Scene 1, Mistress Quickly requires and asks a couple of fellows to arrest him, and this is Fang. Snare, we must arrest Sir John Falstaff. Mistress Quickly says of Falstaff, he is indicted to dinner to the Lubber's Head in Lombard Street, to Master Smooths, the silkman. Now the Lubber's Head is the leopard's head. It's an Elizabethan way of saying leopard's head. And Lombard Street, we'll come back to this in a second, but that is Lombard Street. And you might recall from a few slides ago that this is what Francis actually called Giles Simpson, a Lombard. Well, so they go ahead and arrest Falstaff, and he's quite put out by this, and he blusters and he fusses around, and he says to the Lord Chief Justice, who appears on the scene at that moment, "My lord, I say to you, I do desire deliverance from these officers, being upon hasty employment in the king's affairs." So look at that. Falstaff complains about being arrested because at that moment he happens to be doing some business for the king. Now how extraordinary. You could probably search all the history books to find an example of somebody else complaining of that very reason for being arrested. And here we have Bacon making this complaint, and the very next year the play of Henry IV putting the same complaint in the mouth of Falstaff. So just to look at the parallels, Falstaff being upon hasty employment in the king's affairs. Bacon, he was about Her Majesty's special service. And we also have this very interesting connection between Lombard Street and Lombard Street. Now this is the only occasion in the entire works of Shakespeare where this Lombard Street is mentioned, or the word Lombard is even mentioned. The only occasion. So what does it mean, and why was Francis apologising for calling him a Lombard? Well, it's a fascinating story. For this we need to look at the history of Jews in England. Well, as it happens, there were actually no Jews in England in the 1590s, and the reason was because they had all been expelled in the year 1290. And until 1655, when they were formally permitted to return, there were no Jews. The only exception to that is that if they had converted to Christianity, they were called conversos and they were permitted to stay. Now the Jews had been the moneylenders up to that time, but it meant that there was a gap in the market for moneylenders in England. And that gap was filled by goldsmiths who'd come from Italy, from Lombardy. And they set up shop in London, and in fact they set up in what came to be called Lombard Street, and is called Lombard Street to this day. And Lombard Street was full of goldsmiths, pawnbrokers and moneylenders. Now there's a bit of an overlap in a sense, even though there weren't any Jews supposedly in England, there's a bit of an overlap between this term Lombard and Jew. And in fact there was a historical occasion, 1376, where complaints were made that some of those trading as Lombards were actually Jews. So this word Lombard was a very highly charged word, and it meant moneylender, it meant foreigner, it meant Jew, it meant goldsmith. So this is why Francis used the word but kind of apologised at the same time, because it was, as I say, a highly charged word. All right, so now I want to start looking at some of these questions that we are asked at the beginning of the talk. And I want to start by looking at the relationship between Antonio and Bassanio. So they're the two lead characters in the play, Antonio and Bassanio. Antonio is the elder of the two. And it's clear from their exchanges that Bassanio has been borrowing frequently from Antonio. And yet Antonio is perfectly willing to keep lending to Bassanio, and even willing to stand bond for Bassanio's debts, which is what happens in the play, of course. Now this is a bit odd, because normally in life one doesn't lend money to one's friends quite that happily, and certainly if it's been going on for a while. So the question that really hangs over this part of the play is, why is it that Antonio is so willing to lend money to Bassanio? Now the standard reason that orthodoxy has settled on these days is because that there was a homosexual relationship between the two of them. And you'll see that in the movie that was made a few years ago with Jeremy Irons. You will see that that's being hinted at, even though it's not laid out in the play. It's become now considered the answer to this question. And we're going to come back to that in a second. But now I want to compare Antonio and Bassanio to these two fine-looking fellows. This is Anthony Bacon, the only known picture of him, on the left, and Francis Bacon on the right. They were the youngest sons, the fourth and the fifth sons of Sir Nicholas Bacon. Anthony was the older, born in 1558. Francis came along in 1561. They were very, very close from the beginning. Their mother, Anne Bacon, one of the most educated women in England at her time, spoke French, Latin, Greek, Spanish, Hebrew and Italian. She oversaw their education, which happened together. And then in 1573, she packed the two brothers off to Trinity College, Cambridge, to be educated. The next thing that happens to them after Cambridge is that Francis gets sent to France, and he goes there in 1576, and he accompanies the ambassador, Sir Amias Paulet. And for 3 years, Francis lived at the court of Henry III. He met all the finest people in France, the high people, the poets. He learnt, well, he could already speak French. And in 1579, when his father died, he returned back to England. But he returned in 1581 and 1582. He returned to the continent and did a tour of France, Italy and Spain. Anthony then moved to live in France in 1580, and he lived there for 12 years. Including visits to the court of Henry IV. He was on very good terms with many of the courtiers there and many of the poets of the day. We don't know very much about Anthony's life. There's only been one biographical study, and it's this wonderful book, Golden Lads, by Daphne du Maurier, Sir Francis Bacon, Anthony Bacon and their friends, published I think in the 70s. She was actually a Baconian, but she keeps it under the lid in this book, and she doesn't actually try to claim any connection with Shakespeare, although she does drop a few tantalising hints. But she explores the life of Anthony Bacon, particularly in France, through the letters that have existed, and then his life after he gets back in 1592. Now, I just want to go back to this point about Francis visiting the continent in 1581, because it's a very, very crucial point. And in fact, it's become accepted wisdom. If you go to your local bookshop and peruse the Shakespeare section, if you find any book about who wrote Shakespeare and pull it out and look up Francis Bacon, they will tell you, multiple volumes, all repeat this same thing, that Francis couldn't have written Shakespeare because he never went to Italy. And whoever wrote the plays of Shakespeare must have been to Italy, because they display such an intimate knowledge of Italian life in so many plays. Now, in fact, this is completely wrong. Francis definitely went to Italy, and it's absolutely provable beyond a shadow of a doubt. Here's William Smedley from The Mystery of Francis Bacon, 1912. In 1631 was published in Paris a translation of the Silva Silvarum as the Histoire naturelle de Monsieur Francis Bacon. Prefixed to it is a chapter entitled Discourse sur la vie de Monsieur Francis Bacon. It definitely states that during his youth Bacon travelled to Italy and Spain, which fact is today unrecognised by those who are accepted as authorities in his life. And 100 years later, it's still unrecognised by those who are accepted as authority on his life. There's some other proofs as well. There's some letters that pertain to these journeys he made, but it's certainly the case that Francis went to Italy, and you'll see later that becomes crucial. So let's quickly run over some biographical details now about Francis and Anthony to orient ourselves. Francis was the youngest son of Sir Nicholas Bacon, left penniless in his father's will. Up until the age of 40, he had no apparent source of income. He was constantly in debt through those years, borrowing frequently from all kinds of people, including his brother. Now, there's a great mystery hidden here, and part of the mystery is that his entire output of work in that time was the one slim volume of the essays that came out in 1597, which is a mere 12 short essays. This from a man who, he said he could execute like a clerk of the works. He never let a moment slip by, and yet up until his 40th year, his entire output was this one slim volume of essays. So the question is, what was he doing? Well, Anthony returned in 1592 to London, and he lodged with Francis at Gray's Inn. And they must have been so happy to be back together again because they were so close throughout their entire life. In 1594, he moved into his own lodgings in Bishopsgate, quite near the Bull Inn, where plays were being performed in those days. Then in 1596, he took up residence with the Earl of Essex, and he became very heavily involved with Essex. And then he dies shortly after Essex lost his head in 1601. So in the 1590s, we have Anthony and Francis living in London, both heavily in debt, both borrowing money, although Anthony had some land and some means and resources. And this is when, of course, the Shakespeare plays started really appearing. Now, there's a very interesting letter here, and there's many letters that show that Francis was borrowing heavily at the time, but this letter is particularly interesting in relation to what we're talking about. So we'll just read out this short extract. It's from Francis Bacon to Mr. Skinner. Well, he opens with some pleasantries, and then he says, "Sir, I most earnestly to request you to pleasure me with the loan of £300. My occasion to employ the same presently is important. My meaning, though I say it myself, is entirely as it ought to be, to satisfy you without fail at the day, and your assurance shall be my brother Anthony Bacon's and my own bond." So here we have documentary evidence that Anthony was willing to stand bond for debts that Francis was incurring. Now at this point I want to read you out a paragraph or two which Spedding, Francis's orthodox biographer, comments at this time when he's talking about this period of their lives. The winter of 1594 set in early with frost and snow, and still no solicitor appointed. Francis was trying to get an appointment as solicitor to pay the bills. Meanwhile, the burden of debt and the difficulty of obtaining necessary supplies was daily increasing. Anthony's correspondence during this autumn is full of urgent applications to various friends for loans of money, much of his own necessity arising from his anxiety to supply the necessities of his brother. It is not often, I suppose, that a relation of debtor and creditor like this continues long, even between the best friends, without making their intercourse more or less uncomfortable, especially when the lender has no good an excuse for objecting to fresh demands, not able to lend more without embarrassing himself and placing himself under fresh obligations to other acquaintance. It is worth recording, therefore, says Spedding, that in all this correspondence I find no trace of disagreement between these brothers. Not a word of reproof, expostulation, reluctance, or impatience drops from Anthony. Though his temper had much of the irritability as well as the generosity which commonly belongs to an affectionate nature, the fact deserves notice, not merely for the honour which it reflects upon himself, but as affording a very strong presumption that he at least, who had the best means of judging and was in every way so much interested, did not disapprove the course which Francis was taking, or suspect him of prodigality or carelessness. So Spedding's making it clear that as far as Anthony was concerned, whatever this money was going on was completely legitimate and above board, wasn't being frittered away. Now at this point I'd like to quote from the first scene of Merchant of Venice. And here is the bit where Bassanio is asking Antonio if he can borrow some more money from him. He says, "My chief care is to come fairly off from the great debts wherein my time, something too prodigal, has left me engaged. To you, Antonio, I owe the most, in money and in love. And from your love I have a warranty to unburden all my plots and purposes, how to get clear of all the debts I owe. And then Antonio answers in this way. I pray you, good Bassanio. I pray you, good Bassanio, let me know it. And if it stand, as you yourself still do, within the eye of honour, be assured, my purse, my person, my extremest means lie all unlocked to your occasions. Now, how extraordinary. The relationship there between Antonio and Bassanio in the play is precisely the same as Spedding points out between the brothers in real life. Antonio was perfectly happy to keep loaning money and considered that there was nothing prodigal or wasteful about the reason for this. So what was the relationship between the two of them? Were they homosexual lovers, as contemporary criticism would have it? Well, in fact, no, that's absolutely impossible. And it's impossible because the playwright does actually make it perfectly clear what the relationship between them is. When Bassanio first steps onto the stage, Solanio, who's addressing Antonio, says, "Here comes Bassanio, your most noble kinsman." Now, kinsman can only mean one thing. There's no ambiguity. It means family. Antonio and Bassanio are family. How fascinating. So I want to suggest today, as the first layer of our examination of the hidden scaffolding of Merchant of Venice, that Antonio represents Anthony Bacon and Bassanio represents Francis Bacon. Now you can see already that you don't have to do terribly much to the names to even extract the names. Antonio, Anthony, and here Bassanio is clearly a riff on the word bacon. Well, maybe, we shall see. Now, of course, that doesn't prove that Francis wrote the play. Anyone could have written it and anyone could have glanced at these two characters. But certainly the biography of Anthony and Francis through the 1590s and their relationship happens to correspond precisely with the relationship between the two characters of Antonio and Bassanio in Merchant of Venice. So let's move on to our next question. Why is Antonio sad at the beginning of the play? Well, many scholarly articles have been written on this. There's all kinds of reasons. Again, he's got frustrated homosexual love, apparently, for Bassanio. That's one of the reasons. Well, let's just look at their first two lines. This is the first line that Antonio speaks. This is the first line of the play. "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad." And then several pages of discussion of his sadness. And then Bassanio enters, and this is Bassanio's first line. "Good seniors both, when shall we laugh? Say when." So already there's a contrast there, isn't there, between those two? One of them is sad, one of them's laughing. Well, it's really quite extraordinary how scholars have missed this, but no one seems to have picked up what's going on here. My mind was twigged by the very last sentence of Daphne du Maurier's book, Golden Lads. The very last sentence of her book, she quotes this quote from Montaigne's essays of 1580. And by the way, Anthony was very good friends with Montaigne, and they certainly knew about his essays. Well, this is the last sentence of the Golden Lads by Daphne du Maurier. "Democritus and Heraclitus were two philosophers, of whom the first, finding the condition of man vain and ridiculous, never went out in public but with a mocking and laughing face. Whereas Heraclitus, having pity and compassion on this same condition of ours, wore a face perpetually sad and eyes filled with tears." Well, it's not so much well known these days, but in those days it was very well known. The two philosophers, Democritus and Heraclitus, were paired together. They're called the laughing philosopher and the weeping philosopher. And in fact, you will see many artworks from that time depicting this polarity of the two characters. Here's a classic image from one of the emblem books, which were very popular at the time. And here we have, over here, we have Democritus, the laughing philosopher, and here we have Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher. This is a painting by Rubens in 1603. Here's Democritus laughing over here. Here's Heraclitus frowning and weeping over here. And they're depicted on a globe. And almost inevitably, when artists depicted Heraclitus and Democritus, they are pictured with a globe. Here's another couple of paintings. This is by Terbruygen in 1628, a little bit later. There's Heraclitus over on the right, leaning on his globe, and here's Bassanio, here's Democritus over on this side, laughing. So it was a very common idea at the time of pairing these two philosophers together, the laughing philosopher and the weeping philosopher. is also related to the idea of the masks which have come to represent theatre, the mask of comedy and the mask of tragedy. Now in this case, this isn't actually specifically a depiction of Heraclitus and Democritus. The laughing mask represents Thalia, the muse of comedy. The weeping mask, Melpomene, the muse of tragedy. However, even in those days, they were associated with Heraclitus and Democritus. There's a theatre in Amsterdam which they've discovered all the original drawings from it, and there's a poem over the stage which has these masks and a poem talking about Heraclitus and Democritus and mapping the two laughing and weeping philosophers onto these symbols of comedy and tragedy. So is it possible that the author of the play really was glancing at Democritus and Heraclitus? Well, there's a very solid hint that he drops in the very next scene where Portia actually mentions the weeping philosopher. I fear he will prove the weeping philosopher when he grows old, she says of one of the suitors who's come. That's a direct reference to Heraclitus. So certainly we can be certain that the author of the play had Heraclitus and Democritus on his mind. So is it possible that Heraclitus somehow represents Antonio and Democritus represents Bassanio or Francis? Well, at this point I pull out a quote from Ben Jonson, who said of Francis Bacon, his language, where he could spare or pass by a jest, was nobly censorious. In other words, he was saying Francis could not stop himself from cracking jokes constantly. Whatever he was doing, whatever he was talking about, it was filled with jests. Here we have Francis Bacon's essays, which were published in 1597. They're actually dedicated to his brother Anthony, of whom he says, "You that are next to myself." And in the second essay on discourse, here's the quote. "It is good," says Francis, "in discourse and speech of conversation, to vary and intermingle speech of the present occasion with arguments, tales with reasons, asking of questions with tellings of opinions, and jest with earnest." So here's Francis urging in discourse that jest be mixed with earnest. When we have a serious topic, it's a good idea to mix it up with something funny. Now there are many other quotes that where he also refers to the same kind of idea, but there's one. So here's the second layer I'm going to suggest for Merchant of Venice. Antonio represents Anthony Bacon, but he also represents the weeping philosopher Heraclitus, and this is why he's sad. Meanwhile, Bassanio, who is Francis Bacon, represents Democritus, and this is why he steps on stage and says, "When shall we laugh? Say when." So now we're starting to excavate some of these hidden archaeology. So let's move on to the next question now. So we all know the famous story. Antonio borrows the money on behalf of, well, in fact, Bassanio actually borrows the money, but Antonio stands bond, and the money's being borrowed from Shylock. And the terms, Shylock agrees, but he says, "I won't charge you interest. What I will do is I'll lend you the 3,000 ducats for 3 months on the condition that if you don't pay in the 3 months, you will give me a pound of your flesh," the famous pound of flesh. Well, Antonio says, "No problem. I've got ships coming in. I've got so many ships. I'm going to have so much money by then. This isn't even a risk. I will take it. Let's do it." They sign the bond. And then things go horribly awry, and those of you watch the play have known. So, but why is it? Why does Shylock want this pound of flesh? Well, as I say, the playwright never actually explains it. Well, here's an interesting thought that occurred to me going back 10 years ago. And once the thought had occurred to me, well, I couldn't get it out of my head. And the thought is this. If Antonio and Bassanio really are the Bacon brothers, then the pound of flesh, work with me here, would be a pound of bacon. Okay? All right. Now, when you first think of that, you think, yes, well, that's kind of a bad joke. That's a funny, bad pun. It can't be what's going on. But the more you think about it in the context of the play, the more fascinating this idea becomes. Now, these points that I put up here, these are apparent to orthodox scholars. If you read any book of essays on Merchant of Venice, these are the very things that are brought up by scholars. First of all, the play is full of metaphors of dining and eating. They're constantly talking about going to dinner and whether or not they're going to have dinner. And they're constantly talking about pork. We'll get to that in a moment. There's also a sense that scholars explore of, within the play, men eating each other up as a metaphor for borrowing money, for usury. And the related ideas that go with this, men eating each other up, lending money with interest and then devouring the other person, bringing up ideas of even of cannibalism and of fears of mutual incorporation. Well, there's some extraordinary essays exploring these kind of ideas. But the play also highlights the idea of pork, and we'll see that in a moment. That pork and pork eating play a central role in the play as a marker of the cultural difference between the Jews and the Christians in the play. And there are many, many quotations which bear this out, which we'll see in a moment. But I want to bring up something now about this bond. Shylock twice describes this bond as a merry bond, or merry sport. Go with me to a notary, he says to Antonio. Seal me there your single bond. And in a merry sport, if you repay me not on such a day, in such a place, such sums as are expressed in the condition, let the forfeit be nominated for an equal pound of your fair flesh. Elsewhere he says, then meet me forthwith at the notary's, give him direction for this merry bond. Now again, there's been much scholarly ink spilt on why on earth Shylock could possibly be describing this bond as merry, because on the face of it, there's nothing merry at all about hacking out a pound of flesh from the other person in relation to a debt. So there's really no good reason within the play that anyone has been able to come up with as to why the pound of flesh should be described as a merry bond. So here already we're starting to see how these ideas really start ricocheting through the play. If the pound of flesh is a pound of bacon, if it really is a pun, then here is our element of merriness. And here we have the author mixing jest with earnest. There's several references to pork in the play. Now the word bacon does not actually occur in the play anywhere, but there's this very fascinating line that Lancelot says, after some discussion on the fact that turning Jews into Christians is going to have a terrible effect because it's going to raise the price of hogs. Lancelot then picks up on this theme and says, this raising of Christians will raise the price of hogs. If we grow all to be pork eaters, we shall not have a rasher on the coals for money. Now how fascinating. He's dancing around the concept of bacon here without actually saying the word. We've got hogs, we've got pork eaters, we've got rasher, and in fact this is one of the first occurrences of the word rasher in the English language. If you look up the etymology, they date it to the 1590s. There's actually one or two earlier references which are in themselves rather fascinating. But here we have one of the first references to the idea of a rasher, which means a thin slice of bacon. And it's a rasher because it will cook fast. It's a rash, it's quick. So here we have the playwright walking right up to the concept of bacon and yet not actually saying the word and backing away. But it's not only that reference. In the very first scene, they invite Shylock to have dinner with them. Shylock says no, he's not going to come to dinner because that would involve to smell pork, to eat of the habitation which your prophet the Nazarite conjured the devil into. And there he's referring to the story in the Gospels where Jesus summons the demons from a madman into a herd of swine, and they all then rush off the hills, off the cliff into a lake. I will buy with you, sell with you, talk with you, walk with you, and so following, but I will not eat with you, drink with you, nor pray with you, says Shylock. Nevertheless, a couple of scenes later, Shylock does actually go and dine with Antonio, and again, there's been much scholarly comment on why, having said this, he should be so keen afterwards to do it. He also says later, when he's being asked why he wants the pound of flesh, and he's giving his reasons, and he's developing this idea that, well, people have their own ideas of what they want and what they don't want, and these are all very individual things. And the very first of the examples that he gives, he says, some men there are like not a gaping pig. Now, what is a gaping pig? A gaping pig is a pig with its mouth open. In other words, a pig that's been roasted whole for eating with a baked apple in its mouth. Now, that reminds me of a very good joke, which I'm going to tell you now. It's a Jewish joke, actually, and I came across this joke on a fascinating blog written by a Jewish New Yorker who is a cook and or a chef, who is fascinated by the relationship of Jewishness to pork. And this blog is actually exploring the whole complex set of relationships between Jews and pork. Of course, Orthodox Jews won't eat pork, but secular Jews find themselves eating it, and all kinds of issues arise. Well, on this blog he has this lovely joke, and I'm going to tell you the joke now. So there was an Orthodox rabbi, and he had a secret hankering to eat pork. But of course, he couldn't be seen to be eating pork. So one day, he set out for a town that was far enough away that he would be certain that no one would see him. So he went to this town, and he went to the restaurant, and he sat down and he ordered himself a whole roast suckling pig. And he sat back to wait for it to be delivered. Well, it was delivered to his table, and that exact moment, a couple from his synagogue walked into the restaurant. And there they saw their rabbi and the roast suckling pig on the table in front, and they said, "Rabbi, fancy seeing you here. What's going on?" And the rabbi says, "I ordered a baked apple, and look how they served it." Well, that's a gaping pig. So, in some sense, there's an idea here behind all this what seems like a bad joke when you first hear it. The more you start thinking about this, you see that Bacon, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm just going to say Bacon is riffing on, one of the things he's riffing on is the idea that of Jews secretly wanting to eat pork. Well, it's really more widespread than that. It's like the thing that is forbidden to us is always the thing that we have a secret repressed desire to eat. So the suggestion behind the idea here is that the reason Shylock wants the pound of flesh is because he's got a repressed desire to eat bacon. Now the references don't stop there. Portia, who of course is the woman that Bassanio needs the money in order to woo, to become a suitor, her name is Portia. Now of her, Bassanio says when he's introducing her, her name is Portia, nothing undervalued to Cato's daughter, Brutus's Portia. Now he's referring there to a real person. Her name was Portia Catonus. She lived, there's the dates. She was the daughter of Cato. And Wikipedia tells me that her name is spelt Porcia, but it's occasionally spelt Portia, as it is in the play, especially in 18th century English literature. She was a Roman woman. She was the daughter of Cato and the wife of Brutus. But her name is the feminine version of the Roman family name Porcius, which means pig. It's derived from the Latin porcus. So how extraordinary. Now we'll see later on when we explore the sources of the play that in the source, the original source, the woman who represents Portia doesn't have any name. So the author of the play was free to choose whatever name he wanted for Portia, any name in the entire constellation of the history of female names, and he chose the name that means pig. Now on the face of it, why would you pick the name of your leading lady to be pig? It's not a very complimentary term. Well, she's going to become the wife of Bacon, and so Bacon is sitting back there laughing his head off, could not pass by or spare a jest. But this is by no means the end of it. It turns out that the concept of usury comes from the Hebrew, from the Bible, has all these restrictions on what you can and can't do. And the Hebrew word for usury is nashak, which means to lend upon usury or to bite. It's the same word. A primitive root, and this is from Strong's Concordance, nashak means to strike with a sting, as in a serpent, figuratively, to oppress with interest on a loan, to bite or to lend upon usury. So the very concept of usury itself, when we trace it back, is intertwined with the idea of biting. Now, I'm sure there will be very few people today who would be aware of that fact, but in Bacon's day it was actually quite a commonplace. And in fact, we can turn to Francis Bacon's essay on usury, 1625, in which he says, and he's talking about the conditions under which usury should be permitted. It appears by the balance of commodities and discommodities of usury, two things are to be reconciled. The one, that the tooth of usury be grinded, that it bite not too much. The other, that there be left open a means to invite moneyed men to lend to the merchants for the continuing and quickening of trade. So Bacon's idea in this essay was that there should be two rates of usury, one low rate for the common people when they really needed some extra money, but then a proper decent rate for merchants. So he uses the metaphor here of grinding the tooth of usury. And so he's doing that because he's very familiar with this idea that usury and biting usury and the tooth are intimately related concepts. So now when we come back to the idea of the pound of bacon, men eating each other up, literally taking a chunk or a bite out of another person, it's an entirely appropriate metaphor to use in regards to usury. Okay, so now we've started to excavate a couple of the layers. We have Francis and Antony as Antonio and Bassanio. We have Heraclitus and Democritus, and we have the pound of flesh. Now, you may or may not be convinced yet by these propositions. So I'd like to introduce something absolutely remarkable that occurs in the first folio version of the play. Here it is. This is the first page of The Merchant of Venice from the first folio. And here's where it starts over here. In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. And I put a red box around this passage here, which, as you can see, is right next to the opening of the play in quite a prominent space there. So there I've blown it up. There you can see, here is this passage. I'm going to zoom right in on this passage and we're going to have a good close look at it. So here it is. And this is now, they've been talking to Antonio for half a page, trying to work out why he's sad. And well, there's no good reason. He's not in love, etc., etc. Okay, so Solanio says, not in love, neither? Well then, let us say you are sad because you are not merry. And 'twere as easy for you to laugh and leap and say you are merry because you're not sad. Now, by two-headed Janus, nature has framed strange fellows in her time. Okay, so what's he saying here? He's bringing in the idea of Janus, the Roman god of beginnings and endings, the god of January, the god of doorways, who looks two ways. He has two faces, Janus, as you recall. One face looks to the past and one face looks to the future. But here, the playwright is not talking about two faces looking to the past and the future. He's talking about two faces that are sad and merry, or merry and sad. So the playwright is overlaying over the idea of Janus the idea of merry and sad, sad and merry. Now, in fact, there's one recent book by a scholar on this who is happy to point out in a footnote that this is a reference to Heraclitus and Democritus. And yet this particular author, John LePage, a very fascinating book, but he then goes on to say, well, it's not clear who Shakespeare could have had in mind within the play as to who could be Heraclitus and Democritus. Well, I think we can actually go one step further, and I think we can be certain who Heraclitus and Democritus were in the play. But look at this. We've got two-headed Janus referring to Heraclitus and Democritus put into one person. Now I want to show you something utterly remarkable about this passage. I've highlighted the beginning letters of these 5 lines. This middle line begins with an F. And here we've got because and nature. So we can read, if you like, if you'll work with me here, F, beacon. F, beacon. Okay? But the same thing happens if we go northwards. F, B, con. Can you see that? The start of 4, because and not. F, B, con. So there we go. We've got one F, beacon heading downwards from the F, and we've got a second F, B, con heading up from the F. We've got a Janus face. We've got two faces looking in two different directions. This is really an extraordinary thing because not only is it an acrostic of Francis Bacon's name, it's a double acrostic in the very passage that's bringing up the word Janus. Now, in fact, in the entire works of Shakespeare, Janus is only mentioned twice. The other occasion is in Othello, and it's a passing reference which is really, it applies to what's going on. There's nothing mysterious about it. We can kind of throw it away. So this is really the key reference to Janus in the entire Shakespeare plays. It seems to be brought in for no really good reason, and yet it has this extraordinary double-headed acrostic at the beginning. Here it is blown up so you can have a really good look at it. F, beacon, F, beacon. Now the Elizabethans loved these kinds of games with acrostics and words, and we'll see a couple of examples later on. But you might be saying, well, okay, all right, but it's misspelt, isn't it? It's not F, bacon. It would be even better if this E was an A and this was an O and it was perfect F, bacon. Well, yes and no. Yes, it would be better, Maybe not though, because it would be kind of too obvious, right? So it's a little bit hidden. So the question is it acceptable within the games of Elizabethan literature to slightly alter someone's name for the purpose of making this kind of games? Well, it absolutely is. And I've got a lovely example for you here. This is from the works of Sir John Davies, who was a poet at the time and who was actually a very good friend of Francis Bacon's. And this is as it appears in Sir John Davies' collected works. It's a poem dedicated to Francis Bacon, about Francis. To the Right Honourable Sir Francis Bacon, see that? Knight, Lord High Chancellor of England. And we'll just skip to here. Thy virtuous name and office join with fate to make thee the bright beacon of the state. And he's explained what's going on here. It's an anagram. Bacon with an E is an anagram of beacon. So Sir John Davies is leaving on record for us that it is acceptable to use a variation on the name in order to accomplish these kinds of games. And of course, in Elizabethan times, spelling was much more fluid than it is now. They didn't have a sense of spelling being locked in. Well, now if we flip to the front of the first folio, there's something really remarkable. This is the page that lists the names of the actors in the acting company that performed the Shakespeare plays. And the first one is William Shakespeare, of course. And the W that begins the word William is a large illuminated W. Now I've blown it up for you so you can see it here. And as you can see, this illuminated W contains a Janus face. Two faces joined together. And if you also see, it's very small on the original, but you can see that this guy's laughing and this guy's frowning. So Bacon has actually illustrated on the front page a Janus face of Heraclitus and Democritus. Now that's very unusual. In fact, when I was putting this together, I actually tried to find another example of someone illustrating Janus in relation to Heraclitus and Democritus. In other words, I tried to find a picture of Janus with a laughing and a weeping face. I actually could not find one. I could not find one. So this is unique. There is no one else depicting Janus with two different faces, smiling and laughing as they are here. So I would suggest that the... do we need to stop here or something?
Just a tape change.
Okay, quick tape change. Quick pause. So yeah, I'd like to suggest that this illuminated W here is a key directed directly to this particular passage in Merchant of Venice, where Francis is hiding this secret set of identifications, that Janus represents merry and sad, sad and merry, Democritus and Heraclitus, Antonio and Bassanio, Francis and Anthony. And there it is, I put it next to it just so you can see it one more time. So we have, this is really extraordinary. We have a passage that mentions Janus. We have the double-headed acrostic identifying it in the margin. And then we have an actual picture of Janus at the front of the first folio with the happy and sad faces. I think that's really an extraordinary thing. All right, so let's summarise now the layers that we've put together. The characters are Antonio and Bassanio. The Bacon brothers are Anthony and Francis. The philosophers are Heraclitus and Democritus, the weeping and the laughing philosopher. They also map onto the ideas of tragedy and comedy. And the whole thing is the archetype is two-headed Janus. So yeah, I'd like to suggest that this illuminated W here is a key directed directly to this particular passage in Merchant of Venice, where Francis is hiding this secret set of identifications, that Janus represents merry and sad, sad and merry, Democritus and Heraclitus, Antonio and Bassanio, Francis and Anthony. And there it is, I put it next to it just so you can see it one more time. So we have, this is really extraordinary. We have a passage that mentions Janus. We have the double-headed acrostic identifying it in the margin. And then we have an actual picture of Janus at the front of the first folio with the happy and sad faces. I think that's really an extraordinary thing. All right, so let's summarise now the layers that we've put together. The characters are Antonio and Bassanio. The Bacon brothers are Anthony and Francis. The philosophers are Heraclitus and Democritus, the weeping and the laughing philosopher. They also map onto the ideas of tragedy and comedy, and the whole thing is the archetype is two-headed Janus. Well, that's part one. So now I'd like to excavate our archaeology a little deeper, and I want to actually now look at the sources from which the author of Merchant of Venice has assembled his play. Well, much work's been done on this by scholars, and it turns out that the plot for the play is certainly taken from this book called El Pecorone, which means the simpleton. The plot of this book is essentially identical to what lays out in Merchant of Venice. Well, there are some very, very slight changes which turn out to be very significant, but all the elements of the plot are there, of the Bond plot. It's written by a fellow called Ser Giovanni, or Per Giovanni, I may have that wrong, in Italian in the 14th century, and it was published in Milan in 1558. So 3 years before Bacon was born, so there's no question of suggesting that Bacon wrote it. The fascinating thing about this is while scholars absolutely are in agreement that this was the source of the plot of the play, it was written in Italian and was never translated into English at that time. So that presents a major problem for those who still believe that William Shakespeare of Stratford was the author, because he certainly didn't have any Italian. And so scholars don't like to linger over this point, but they suggest that perhaps there was an English translation which has now been lost. Absolute nonsense. There was no English translation. In fact, it does go one step further than that, because it has been demonstrated that the author certainly was using the Italian version of this. You can compare words and phrases back to the Italian and from the English, and you can make a compelling case that the author must have had the Italian version at his elbow when he was writing it. Well, here's the frontispiece of this book when it came out in 1558, Il Pecorone, printed in Milan. And just to quickly summarise the plot, it concerns the youngest of 3 sons, whose name was Gianetto, who was left penniless in his father's will, who was then assisted financially by his godfather, Anselmo, who was a rich merchant in Venice. And then it all develops from there, exactly as it does in the play. Now, there's another book that also is very important for Merchant of Venice, and it came out in Paris in 1581. And it's this book. It's called The Epitomes de 100 Histoires, The Epitomes of 100 Stories, by a fellow called Alexander Sylvain. Now, this is a fascinating book. What it consists of, it's exercises in oratory. And there's 100 of these exercises in oratory in this book. And in each exercise, the author has picked a topic or an idea from literature, or even a few of them of his own invention, and he's constructed 2 speeches, one in favour of a proposition, the other against the proposition. And he's done this 100 times as a set of exercises for oratory. Well, the 95th exercise in this book of 100 is between the Jew and the merchant over the pound of flesh. And he has taken it from Il Pecorone. Again, this is non-controversial. So here we are, Alexander Sylvain, published in Paris 1581 in French, Epitome 95, un juif qui pour sa dette veut un livre de la chair d'un chrétien, a pound of flesh of the Christian. And so we have the Jew gives his reasons for wanting the pound of flesh, the Christian says why he shouldn't have to have the pound of flesh, and then it takes 3 or 4 pages. But again, it's certainly the case that quotations and ideas from these couple of pages turn up in Merchant of Venice. Now, the amazing thing about this book is that it was translated into English and published in London in 1596. Extraordinary. This is the very year when Merchant of Venice was being written, and someone arranged to have this book published in English and issued in London. Now you can see here it's written in French by Alexander Sylvain and Englished by LP, which is a lovely word, Englished. Okay, I had another. So we'll see this in a moment. The book was called The Orator when it was translated, and this LP stands for a fellow called Lazarus Pio. And this Lazarus Pio is known now who it was. It was a writer called Anthony Mundy, who wrote other things during that time. He was one of the lesser writers of the day, and he did other translations from the French also under this other pen name, Lazarus Pio. It's now absolutely established. Lazarus Pio was Anthony Mundy. So here we are. Here's just zooming in on that page, the front, written in French by Alexander Sylvain. And this is the heading from the English part of the 95th declamation. A Jew unto whom a Christian merchant owed 900 crowns would have summoned him for the same, etc., etc. And then he's demanded the pound of flesh. And it's our own familiar plot that we're used to. So we've got these three books now. We've got Il Peperone, written in Italian in 1558. We've got the Epitomes, written in Paris in 1581. And we've got the Orator in London in 1596. So we have this kind of chain of these three texts from which Merchant of Venice has been created. Now I'm rather fascinated by this Alexander Sylvain. First of all, think about his name, Alexander Sylvain. It is a pen name. It's accepted as a pen name of a fellow called Alexander van den Busch. But think about this name, Alexander Sylvain. Break it down what it means. Alexander means conqueror. Sylvain means nature. So Alexander Sylvain we could decode as conqueror of nature. Now in Baconian terms, that's a very provocative kind of phrase, because you could almost use that as a title of Bacon, conqueror of nature. That is what his philosophical works were all about. So let's look at the works of this Alexander van den Busch. Well, it becomes very curious. He was actually a soldier. He wasn't a writer at all. But he published one book in 1571 under his own name, without any hint of the Alexander Sylvain, and it's called Arithmetique Militaire. And it's a book about how to arrange your soldiers on the battlefield correctly, geometrically, for the best strategic advantage. He published nothing before or after that, but then, in the last few years of his life, 4 books came out from under his pen, all with this Alexander Sylvain name. In 1576, there was a book called Poems and Anagrams. It contains delightful poems and anagrams about all the people at Henry III's court. In 1579, he brings out a book of 55 of these oratorical exercises, which he expands and in 1581 publishes as the full 100 exercises. And then in 1582, he produces a book called 50 Énigmes Français, 50 French enigmas, which are 50 kind of puzzles, if you like, clever literary puzzles that he then explains what they mean. And then at the end of the book, he just tosses in a few extra puzzles in Spanish. Well, let's have a quick look at those books. Here we have the Arithmetique Militaire by van den Busch. No trace of Sylvain's name on it. Here's a couple of random pages from it. As you can see, these are how to lay out your troops in the right geometrical and mathematical way. And now we have the Sylvain works. Here is the 1576, the anagrams. And here is an example from this anagrams book. So here's one of the pages. This is a poem that he's written about Henry de Valois, and he's used the first letter of each line to spell out Henri de Valois as an acrostic. So this book is, every poem in the book does that. It picks a person and then it writes their name down the side, then it composes a delightful poem about their name. So it's obviously someone who's very clever with courtly wit. Here we have the 55 histories, and then here we have the Epitomes with the full 100 histories coming out in 1579 and 81, both under the name Sylvain. And then here we have the 1582 book, the Enigmas, again under the name of Sylvain, somewhere there, up there, Alexandre Sylvain. Okay, so let's just now, side by side, compare the works of Alexander Sylvain and the movements of Francis Bacon at the time. In 1576, out comes the first version. That's the year that Francis arrives at the court. In 1579, he brings out the 55 stories. Well, that's the last year he's there. Then Francis goes back to England. So he comes back for 1581, 1582. He does a tour of France, Italy and Spain, as we've seen. In 1581, this Alexander Sylvain brings out his Epitomes book. Then in 1582, he brings out the French Enigmas with a couple of Spanish ones added in. Well, when I first started looking at this, I thought, I want to believe that Alexander Sylvain is a pen name of Francis, but could it possibly be? Could it really be? Could Francis, as a young man, as a teenager, have been writing these books under a pen name in France? Well, I couldn't really let myself believe that until I discovered this. This is the dedication to the English version, the Orator, that came out in 1596. It's dedicated to Lord St. John, Baron of Blestow. Now this is certain, and it's signed, as you can see, by Lazarus Pio at the end. Now this is certainly not the dedication from the 1581 book in French. And we can be certain of that, first because it is signed by the translator, Lazarus Pio, but it's addressed to Lord St. John, who was a real person in England at that time. And it's also very different from the dedication of the 1581 book. So there's no question about it. This is a fresh dedication written in 1596, ostensibly by the translator. But there's something very fascinating in here that I want to zero in on, and I've enlarged it here. The translator says of this book, describing it, having hewn out of my rough wit this first fruit of mine oratory. What an extraordinary thing. This is the translator. This is not the first fruit of the translator's oratory. It's the translator. But that's clearly what he's saying. This Lazarus Pio is claiming that the book that follows was the first fruit of his oratory. Well, how extraordinary. If we go to Lazarus Pio's other books that he translated and we look at the dedication in them, it's clear in those ones that he knows what's going on. He describes himself as the translator. He protests that he's not a scholar. He says he's done the best job that he can with the author's work. But in this particular book, he throws all that overboard and he's actually claiming to have written the original. So let's cut to the chase. This is what happened. In 1581, Francis went to Italy and there he read Il Pecorone in the Italian, which he was fluent in. It inspired him to write the 95th exercise in his book The Epitomes, which he published in French in Paris under the name Alexander Sylvain. Then in 1596 he arranged for this book to be translated into English by Anthony Mundy, who he worked with, under the translation name Lazarus Pio, and it was published as The Orator. But Bacon himself wrote the dedication, signing it Lazarus Pio, taking credit for the original Epitomes of 1581. And then, at that time, he used this set of books as the basis for Merchant of Venice. Without going into too much detail, this one is so fascinating that I can't help myself to share it with you. So what I want to demonstrate by this is that the author of Merchant of Venice had all these original texts beside him, the Italian and the French. If we look at the first one, Epitomes 1581, Le juge ordinaire ordonne que le juif coupera justement un livre de la chair. The ordinary judge of the place ordered that the Jew would cut just a pound of flesh. But you can see there, even if you can't read French, you can see that justement applies to coupera. Justement there is an adverb. Now when it gets translated by Anthony Mundy in 1596, this is the way it comes out. The ordinary judge of the place appointed him to cut off a just pound of the Christian flesh. And if he cut more or less than a pound. So in this case, the word just has shown up again, but in this case it's not an adverb, it's qualifying pound, so it's an adjective. Now let's turn to Merchant of Venice. In Merchant of Venice, in the crucial trial scene, Portia says, "Shed then no blood, nor cut thou less or more, but just a pound of flesh. If thou cuts more or less than a just pound." Now look what's going on there. This just is correctly an adverb because it's qualifying cut, but this just is qualifying pound and it's an adjective. So Francis, writing Merchant of Venice, has noticed that Anthony Mundy kind of got it a little bit wrong with that word, and he can't help himself but correct it, but he's also nodding to the orator by adding it as well. So the word just is put in twice, once as an adjective, once as an adverb. It's like he's leaving us a trail of breadcrumbs through these texts. Here's a lovely line from midway through the play, from Merchant of Venice. Nerissa says to Portia, "What say you then to Falconbridge, the young Baron of England?" And he's one of the suitors. And Portia says, "You know I say nothing to him, for he understands not me, nor I him. He hath neither Latin, French, or Italian." In other words, Portia's saying, the only suitable suitor for me is someone who could speak Latin, French, and Italian. And this is Bassanio, of course, who is Francis. And so again, we've got a little trail of breadcrumbs here telling us that Bassanio could speak Latin, French or Italian as could Francis. One aspect is the merry aspect of the bond. And in fact, this pound of flesh story actually goes way back in history. There are many, many, many sources of this pound of flesh, going right back to the Mahabharata. It's kind of a deep story of humanity, this idea of borrowing money and this pound of flesh. But in none of these sources, except Shakespeare, is the bond described as a merry bond. It's unique to Shakespeare that the bond is merry, mixing jest with earnest, the pound of bacon. Food and dining as the key metaphor of the play. This doesn't occur in Il Pecorone or The Orator or any of this. And I mentioned before that some of the details are tweaked in Merchant of Venice. In Il Pecorone, it's not Bassanio taking out the loan. In Il Pecorone, Antonio takes out the loan and he freely gives the money to Bassanio. But in Merchant of Venice, it's subtly and specifically different. It's Bassanio taking out the loan and Antonio standing bond for it. In other words, the author has changed the details, and in this case, they have been changed so that they precisely match the biographical details of Francis and Anthony. And I think that's very telling. Well, that's the sources for the pound of flesh. Now I want to talk about the sources for the Heraclitus and Democritus. This is really extraordinary. This is a poem called A Dialogue Upon the Troubles Past between Heraclitus and Democritus, the weeping and the laughing philosophers, published in English in 1599, and I hope you're keeping track of the dates here. It's included in a book called The Miracle of the Peace in France, celebrated by the ghost of the divine Dubartas, translated by Joshua Sylvester, and there it is, 1599. This is all fascinating, but we're not going to go into that. We want to focus on this poem, The Dialogues Past between Heraclitus and Democritus. So there's just a summary of that information. Now the first thing about this book is that it's dedicated to Anthony Bacon. It's dedicated to Anthony Bacon. Here's the dedication: to the most honourable, learned and religious gent, Mr. Anthony Bacon. In the second edition of this book, it was published as part of a complete works in 1605. Here is the dedication again to Anthony Bacon, and you can see that at the top of the page is the famous Archer device, printing device, which appears on the first folio, and Bacon's works, and the King James Bible, and some of these other key works of the day. So this particular translation from the French of this particular book, dedicated to Anthony Bacon and printed under the Shakespeare printing device. Now, in this poem occurs this extraordinary line from Democritus. It's a dialogue. They have verses with each other. And Democritus says to Heraclitus, "Ha, but why weepst thou? Wherefore in this sort dost thou lament amid this merry sport?" There's the exact phrase, merry sport, turning up in this 1599 book. Remember, the play was finished in 1598. Now, this is the only occasion in the entire works of Shakespeare where that phrase occurs, merry sport. He uses the word merry, he uses the word sport, but he never uses merry sport together except in The Merchant of Venice. And here it is turning up in this poem that apparently comes out the following year. But there's also another very, very remarkable phrase in this poem. Democritus says, "I take the world to be but as a stage, where net-masked men do play their personage." In Merchant of Venice, Antonio says, "I hold the world but as the world, Gratiano, a stage, where every man must play his part, and mine a sad one." One of the most famous ideas from Shakespeare, and yet here it is turning up in this play, in this poem of 1599. It also turns up in As You Like It, "All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players," perhaps the most famous line in all of Shakespeare. Funnily enough, it also turns up in Francis Bacon's Device for Essex, 1595, "While your life is nothing but a continual acting upon a stage." So there's a real mystery here. It's clear that either the play has borrowed from the poem or the poem has borrowed from the play, one or the other. But both of them are in a sense impossible. Let's first of all work out if the play could have borrowed from the poem. Well, it couldn't, because the play was finished in 1598 and the poem wasn't published until 1599. It was published in French in 1598, but that would mean, well, the poem came after the play. So the author of the play couldn't have been borrowing from the poem, but could it have been the other way around? Well, that's impossible either. That would mean that the author of the poem saw the play performed in London, raced back to Paris, remembered a couple of the lines. It's ridiculous. So whichever way you look at it, it doesn't seem possible. And I suggest that the answer to this conundrum is that the author of the play must have had an unpublished version of this poem at his elbow when he was writing the play. So here we have an absolutely fascinating poem which includes several key phrases from Merchant of Venice in the context of a dialogue between Heraclitus and Democritus, something that has never before today been identified with Merchant of Venice. And in this book is dedicated to Anthony Bacon and printed under the printing device of the first folio. Absolutely extraordinary. And there's one other absolutely amazing line in this poem. I laugh to see how fortune, like a ball, plays with the globe of this inconstant all. How she degrades these and graces those, how some whom she lifts up, down again she throws. So I've highlighted the two words there, fortune and globe, both of which have been capitalised. Now they're very provocative words because of course they remind us of the theatres, the Fortune Theatre and the Globe Theatre. Now let's just refresh ourselves on Elizabethan theatre history. Here's a lovely map of London taken from Google Earth. In 1598, the two main playhouses were the Theatre and the Rose down here, and Shakespeare's troupe played here and the other troupe played here. Now it was a very famous event at the end of 1598. There was all kinds of behind the scenes problems with ownership of the land and so forth, and what they decided to do to cut through all the clutter, they simply demolished the theatre. They took it apart beam by beam and they walked it down across the Thames and rebuilt the theatre as the Globe in 1599. Well, this meant that they were just around the corner from the Rose, which was no good for the other players, so they formed themselves a new theatre up there called the Fortune, which was built in 1599-1600. So how extraordinary that this poem, written in 1598 and appearing in London in 1599, should just happen to predict, as it were, the names of the two theatres, the Fortune and the Globe. There's quite a mystery there. We could go on with that later, but I'll keep going. All right, well, we're still talking about the sources for Heraclitus and Democritus. Now, as I was working through all this material and discovering this and getting quite excited, I realised one day that there was one thing I was missing in this lovely set of proofs. What I was missing was Francis Bacon himself identifying himself as Democritus. This was the key. I could see that Francis was associated with Bassanio. I could see Bassanio was associated with Democritus. But what I needed to close the gap was Francis himself declaring that he is Democritus. Well, here's the letter, the famous letter for Baconians that Francis Bacon wrote to Lord Burleigh in 1592. Now, the context of this letter is that he'd been trying to get a position, a paid position from the Queen that would enable him to write freely. He just wanted an income so he could write. I know the feeling. But they weren't going to have a bar of it. They weren't giving him any money, so he was obliged to keep borrowing from these fellows like Giles Simpson. Well, in 1592, Francis was getting really sick of this situation. He wrote one more letter to try and convince them to do this. And in this part of the letter, he's saying what he will do if they don't agree to give him his suit. He says, this is what I'll do. I'll sell the inheritance that I have, and I'll purchase some lease of quick revenue or some office of gain that shall be executed by deputy, and so give over all care of service, and become some sorry bookmaker, or a true pioneer in that mine of truth which he said lay so deep. Well, who said? Who said lay so deep? Doesn't tell us. Leaves it hanging. Read that 1,000 times and it won't help you. So who actually said this? Who talked about a true pioneer in that mine of truth? How can we find out where this came from? Well, fortunately, Francis clears it up for us. This is in the Advancement of Learning, 1605. He answers the riddle. And I quote, "Here we will now proceed to natural philosophy. If then it be true that Democritus said that the truth of nature lies hid in certain deep mines and caves." So there we are. Francis is identifying that it was Democritus who said that. Let's just go back to the letter. I'll become some sorry bookmaker or a true pioneer in that mine of truth, which he said lay so deep. Democritus said the truth of nature lies hidden in certain deep mines and caves. Well, Francis goes on. If that's the case, he said, that Democritus said that, then it would be good to divide natural philosophy into the mine and the furnace, and to make two professions or occupations of natural philosophers, some to be pioneers and some smiths, some to dig and some to refine. In other words, Democritus said that truth requires digging to get to, that truth is buried down in the layers, that to get to truth we have to dig down into the depths and bring it up. But furthermore, digging it up is only half the job. Then we have to do something with what we've dug up. We have to smelt it, we have to turn it into the goods that make up the world. So Francis is saying here that there's essentially two valid courses of action for philosophers. You can either be a pioneer or you can be a smith. And this is what Francis was saying to Lord Burleigh. He was saying, I'll become some sorry bookmaker or a true pioneer in that mine of truth. In other words, Francis was saying, I will follow after Democritus. My career will be a Democritean career in philosophy. So here's Francis identifying himself at the beginning of his career with Democritus. Well, in fact, this particular quote comes from a very particular book of Democritus. Well, it's not Democritus, we don't have any of his books. It comes from Diogenes Laertius, The Lives of the Eminent Philosophers, which is a book which discusses biographies of the philosophers who have come before. And in this book from Diogenes Laertius, Lives of the Philosophers, he tells us about Democritus. Well, it turns out that Democritus is the youngest of three sons. He had inheritance issues. He was ripped off by his brothers, and he spent all his money on travelling around to educate himself. He took all of knowledge to be his province. He decided that he was going to become an expert on absolutely everything, which might remind you of someone. He didn't care about fame. It was said of him that he never went to Athens. In other words, he didn't care about going to Athens and making a name for himself. He wandered around the countryside philosophizing, and he would laugh at every situation. So we can.
Date is that?
This is like 300 BC or something like that. So one can well imagine now Francis reading Diogenes Laertius, and we know he read it because he quotes him, and he reading that Democritus was the youngest of three sons, that he spent all his money, that he took all knowledge to be his province, that he laughed at every situation. We can well imagine Francis saying, I am Democritus. But wouldn't it be nice to have one extra thing that really nails it down? Well, here it is. This is actually from the book, Diogenes Laertius, the English translation, talking about Democritus. The same authority states that when he returned from his travels, he was reduced to a humble mode of life because he'd exhausted his means. And because of his poverty, he was supported by his brother, Damasus. So how do you like that? Democritus was borrowing money from his brother. So now we're able to really lay out these layers. In The Merchant of Venice, we have Antonio and Bassanio. In Il Pecorone, they correspond to Ansaldo and Gianetto. They correspond to the Bacon brothers, Anthony and Francis. They correspond to the philosophers Heraclitus and Democritus, who didn't live together, but they've been lumped together in the history of philosophy. But they also correspond to Democritus' own biography and life, Damasus, his brother, and Democritus. And so in all these different situations, these fictional and biographical situations, we have a pair of brothers where the youngest one lost out in his inheritance, devoted himself to writing, and was supporting himself by borrowing from his brother. It's extraordinary. Well, we're nearly at the end, but I guess we do have to show that Francis Bacon did write Merchant of Venice. So let's have a couple of parallels between Francis's own works and Merchant of Venice. This one's just gold. In his Promus notebook, which was Francis's notebook of things that he collected, commonplace sayings and so forth that he collected to use, It's definitely written by 1595. The book is finished by 1595, and in it one can find the phrase, "All is not gold that glisters." Well, in The Merchant of Venice, when one of the suitors comes in and he looks at the gold casket, he says, "All that glisters is not gold." Now that's actually a phrase that has turned up many places from Chaucer. Chaucer uses it all the way through. But in every other single occasion in literature where it's used, the word is glitters. All that glitters is not gold. The only writer who uses the phrase glisters is Shakespeare. And yet, 2 years before the play was written, there it is in Francis' notebook, glisters. Now this one is a little bit lengthy, but it's just so beautiful that stick with me if I haven't exhausted your patience. This one's worth it. In the final act of Merchant of Venice, the following exchange takes place between Portia and Nerissa. Portia says, "That light we see is burning in my hall. How far that little candle throws his beams. So shines a good deed in a naughty world." Nerissa says, "When the moon shone, we did not see the candle." And Portia says, "So doth the greater glory dim the less. A substitute shines brightly as a king until a king be by, and then his state empties itself, as does an inland brook into the main of waters." So you can see the metaphor that Francis is making here. A candle is very, very bright, but when the moon comes out, all of a sudden the moon is much brighter than the candle. Well, that's just as if a substitute is standing in for the king, where the substitute seems to be very grand, but when the king comes back, the substitute is nothing. It's also like a river. A river seems terrific. Look at that mighty river, but when it empties into the sea, you realise it's nothing. So we've got a triple conjunction of metaphors here. The candle and the moon, the substitute and the king, the river falling into the main. Now here's a quote from Francis Bacon's A Brief Discourse Touching the Happy Union of the Kingdom of England and Scotland. This was a letter, as it were, that he wrote to King James, talking about the implications of Scotland joining with England, which is the lesser joining with the greater. And he says, he's talking about the conditions under which the lesser joins with the greater, Scotland the lesser joining with England the greater. He says the second condition is that the greater draws the less. So we see when two lights do meet, the greater doth darken and drown the less. And when a small river runs into a greater, it loses both the name and the stream. So there we have the exact triple conjunction of ideas as occurs in Merchant of Venice. Well, you might say, but it's 1603. This is 5 years later. Perhaps Francis read The Merchant of Venice, stole the idea and put that in. Well, okay. But before we get to that, here's the front page of the Brief Discourse of the Happy Union of the Kingdoms of England and Scotland. And I think the first line is very interesting. "I do find it strange, excellent King, that when Heraclitus, he that was surnamed the Obscure, had set forth a certain book which is now not extant, many men took it for a discourse of nature." In other words, Francis dares to bring up the name Heraclitus in the context of this work where he's dropping parallels to The Merchant of Venice. As I say, it's almost as if there's a trail of breadcrumbs. But did he copy The Merchant of Venice? Well, actually, no, he didn't. Because Francis was also responsible for this Gesta Graeorum, 1594, which was the account of the revels at Gray's Inn. And it's accepted by Orthodox scholars that Francis wrote this. And in this book, 1594, 2 years before Merchant, "But now our principality is determined, which, although it shines very bright in ours and others' darkness, yet at the royal presence of Her Majesty it appears as an obscure shadow. In this, not unlike the morning star, which looks very cheerfully in the world so long as the sun looks not on it, or as the great rivers that triumph in the multitude of their waters until they come to the sea." The same triple parallel before, during and after. Well, we're nearly at the end now. A couple of quick more ones. Remember back to Falstaff in Henry IV Part 2, how we showed that was connected to the arrest. Well, it also turns out that Henry IV also connects up to the orator, the speech of the Jew, and there's a very fascinating parallel here. Falstaff splutters at one point in Henry IV Part 2, "I can get no remedy against this consumption of the purse. Borrowing only lingers and lingers it out, but the disease is incurable." The disease of the consumption of the purse, not having enough money. Or the Jew in the orator, when he's asked why he wants the pound of flesh, he says, and again, he doesn't give a good reason, but he's giving a few reasons that he could give if he felt like giving reasons. I might also say that I have need of this flesh to cure a friend of mine of a certain malady, which is otherwise incurable. So it's almost as if we have these hidden links going on between these different works and different plays, invisible behind the scenes links that Francis is showing us. At the end of Henry IV, there's an epilogue where the author steps onto the stage and gives a speech at the end of the play. This is it as it appears in the first folio. There's the archer device at the top again. And I want to highlight something that happens in the middle here. And this is the author of the play, obviously played by an actor. And the speech that he's making is kind of saying this. He's saying, previously I've promised you another play after Henry IV Part 1. He says, I promised you another play. Well, this is it. And I'm hoping that I've fulfilled my promise to you or my debt to you. So this is what he says. I was lately here in the end of a displeasing play to pray your patience for it and to promise you a better. I did mean, indeed, to pay you with this, which, if, like an ill venture, it come unluckily home, I break, and you, my gentle creditors, lose. Here I promised you I would be, and here I commit my body to your mercies. Bate me some, I'll pay you some, as most debtors do, promise you infinitely. What does this mean? Like an ill venture, it come unluckily home. An ill venture is a ship that's been sent off to do business and to come back. That's exactly what happens in Merchant of Venice. This is why Antonio lost the bond, because his ships, his ill ventures, came not luckily home. And now here we have the author standing up and saying, oh, well, don't worry about that. I said I'd pay you. I couldn't. So here I commit my body to your mercies, my pound of flesh to your mercies. So here we have another link between Henry IV and Merchant of Venice and more of these breadcrumbs that Francis has been dropping along the way. Well, we're nearly there now, but we've still got one or two questions to answer. How did Bassanio run up his debts? He doesn't tell us at the start of the play, but we know he's already been borrowing from Antonio, but the purpose is unclear. This is the line. "'Tis not unknown to you, Antonio, how much I have disabled mine estate by something showing a more swelling port than my faint means would grant continuance." So Bassanio is saying, okay, you know I've been borrowing money for something. I'm just going to refer to it as a swelling port. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, a swelling is a very Baconian and very Shakespearean word, which is often applied to water. A swelling port is a port where the tide has come in, which means when the tide comes in, it means boats can sail in and out. So by swelling port, he's referring to sending ships out into the world. But Bassanio wasn't sending any ships out into the world. So what's he talking about? Well, without getting into whether or not Bacon wrote this book, Aristotle's Politic, let's just pull out this phrase from it. The fortune of books published resembles that of ships at sea. And this was an idea that Bacon came back to over and over, that books going out into the world are like ships going out on the ocean. Books take ideas around the world, just like ships take commodities around the world. This was actually a central motif of Bacon's work. Here we are in Advancement of Learning. If therefore the invention of the ship was thought so noble, which carries commodities from place to place, and consociateth the remotest regions in participation of their fruits, how much more are letters or books to be valued, which like ships pass through the vast ocean of time and convey knowledge and inventions to the remotest age. And here is the cover of the Advancement of Learning, and here's the ship passing out through the Pillars of Hercules, which is representing Bacon's books going out. So what he's telling us is that Bassanio's money had been spent not on ships, but ships are books on books, that he became a sorry bookmaker. So we really have a series of displacements in operation here. Books are boats. London is Venice. Lombards and foreigners are Jews. Giles Simpson is Shylock, and Francis and Anthony are Bassanio and Antonio. This was Francis' way of dealing with some very provocative political ideas in the context of the 1590s, where there were riots over Dutch traders who'd come in. This was his way of dealing with a very difficult political subject without raising the ire of the authorities, by substituting and displacing all these issues across to Venice. Well, we're nearly there now. I mentioned the emblem books early on, and I showed you the picture of Heraclitus and Democritus. Well, these emblem books were very popular in this time. They went through 100 editions, and everyone used them and loved them. And they consist of all these interesting enigmatic pictures with a poem. And this is one of the famous ones. It's a bit hard to see in this version I've shown you, but you might be able to see. Here is a winged figure, and he's got an hourglass here somewhere, and he's pulling a naked woman out from a cave. And it's headed, Veritas Filia Temporis, Truth, the Daughter of Time. And this appears in one of the most famous of the emblem books, Emblemata 1595, Adrianus Junius. Well, what does this mean? Well, fortunately, the author tells us. So this is now the quote from the book. He tells us what this emblem means. He says, the saying of the old poet is on everyone's lips, truth is the daughter of time. Because evidently time brings truth to light, and Saturn is without doubt to be regarded as time. Now certainly, he goes on, it is well known that Democritus said that truth was once buried and lay hidden in a very deep well, from which comes the reason for devising this emblem. Truth should then be represented as a naked young woman emerging from the navel up out of a dark cave among rocks, whom Saturn, flying in the air, leads out by the right hand. So Junius was telling us that this image is the end product of the Democritean philosophy, that truth is hidden in the deep mines and the dark caves of the earth. We need to dig it out. That takes time, so eventually time brings truth, personified as the woman, out of the caves of the earth. Published posthumously the year or two after Francis died, his final work of his life, The New Atlantis, a work unfinished, and it has this fascinating emblem on the front cover. A bit hard to see, so I've blown it up for you. And as you can see, we have a winged figure with an hourglass helping a naked woman out of a cave. And around we have tempor patet occulta veritas. Time brings forth hidden truth. So Francis has on his final work stamped the front of the work with an emblem which represents the final stage of the Democritean philosophical process of bringing truth to light out of the deep, dark caves of the earth. So he stamped the beginning of his career with the letter to Burleigh by declaring that he was going to work in Democritus's ideals, and he stamped the end of his work by showing that he had succeeded and he was bringing truth out of the caves. Extraordinary. So Francis did very much associate himself with Democritus. And this is why he's overlaid Democritus and Heraclitus over the characters of Bassanio and Antony in the play. Well, this is from Francis's notebook. To give authors their due as you give time his due, which is to discover truth, which he explains in Advancement of Learning. Let great authors have their due, as time, which is the author of authors, be not deprived of his due, which is further and further to discover truth. And there it is. Francis should have his due now in time, because time has brought forth the truth. So really that just leaves one question that we didn't answer. When shall we laugh? Say when. Well, the answer is today. 400 years later, we finally cracked the joke at the heart of Merchant of Venice. Thank you very much. Like to ask any questions or have any comments?
So, Simon, thank you for a splendid talk.
Thank you, Susan.
And so well researched.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very much for sharing your new research with us. So, because of the time constraints, we could have a few brief questions, and they must be relevant to the talk.
Thoroughly enjoyed your talk, and I'm sorry I have to go, but I've booked a car and I can't delay. But thank you very much indeed.
And Mary is our vice president, and Mary's mother worked for the Francis Bacon Society as well.
Yeah,
Thank you,
she
Mary.
started in 1956.
Yeah, I mean, that was excellent, Simon, as I said, and I'm fairly new to the whole Bacon and Shakespeare kind of area anyway. I mean, 5 years is not a long time, you know, compared to people who've been devoting their lives to this. But first an observation, it's interesting when you say that often people who are in this position of kind of like academic authority, something will be written, and then that just becomes like the truth cast in stone, and it almost becomes undiscussable and unquestionable and so forth. So it's very refreshing, I think, to see that these questions are now really being asked. You know, people are digging for the truth. And I think, if I picked it up right, and I really resonate with this, the democratist bit about you've got to have this sense of humour about it as well.
Yeah.
You know, and take it lightly. You know, you said, I had this thought. And I go through similar kind of things. And, you know, I'm no academic, and I respect academics, but we do our different things in different ways. But my question would be, in terms of the acrostics and the ciphers, I mean, again, there's been so much, quotes, debunking of all this. And you came up with a very simple one there. So my question would be, how far have you gone into the kind of deciphering of the works, maybe generally, and what's your kind of thoughts on these deep hidden codes? Well, I mean, I believe there are a lot of deep, and layers as well. It's interesting to use the words layers, that as you strip one layer away, you're into a deeper layer and what have you. But what are your thoughts about the encryption and the decryption and the coding and the decoding and that whole process?
Well,
is that a bit of a wide question?
I think I can attack it. Well, I think, as you say, there's layers. I think it begins with some very simple decipherings that don't really require any like we saw there, and it's by no means the only. I mean, what I like about the acrostics is, first of all, it's by no means the only example. There's a perfect F. Bacon acrostic on the first full page of text in the first folio, and there's others as well. Well, you might say, well, maybe that's just random letters and words coming together, but the fact is the Elizabethans loved these acrostics, as you saw in the one that I showed. So that was very much a factor in their poetry in that day. So in that case, given that they played with acrostics, given these acrostics are present, that seems to me very sort of low objection levels. It's what happened to the Baconian movement, as we all know, 100 years ago. There was a rush of blood to the head, and the whole thing ended up sort of self-imploding. But in many ways, Francis is the one responsible for that, because he was fascinated by codes and ciphers, and he speaks specifically about that. So it's not at all out of the question that we should expect to be able to find these there. And I'm sure as time goes on, we will find codes that are absolutely undeniable. But I think at this phase in the Baconian movement, it's good to kind of hold back a little from those and really make the foundation so solid that now there's no question that Francis wrote it, and then from there to discover the codes, rather than to come in from the angle of the codes. Because for people outside, the world that we're trying to convince here, it seems like we've all lost our collective minds. And so I think the codes are there, but I think we have to be very, very careful how much weight we put on those. And I would rather put almost no weight on them and use them, once the case has already been established, use them to show that they're marks of authenticity rather than proofs that can carry the full burden and weight of the proof. So I'm fascinated by them, but I hesitate to sort of make too much of them without the foundations. Yeah.
That was just so mind-bogglingly wonderful, and the research is just, I can't believe it. I'd love to know where you found it all and how many centuries it took you to do it, but anyway.
Well, let me just comment on that, because it's really been in two bursts, this work. It was 10 years ago that I had the pound of bacon idea, which then once it had gone into my head, I couldn't get it out of my head. But 10 years ago, none of these books were digitised and online. Now I've come back 10 years later to do it, and now all these books that I've shown you today are all fully digitised, fully online, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So any of these obscure works from the 1500s, there it is. You can just bring it up and you can read it. So without even having to get out of my couch, I can be finding all these things.
Still, I haven't found those.
Well, I've just followed my nose.
Who else but us is hearing what you're saying?
Nobody yet.
Well, how is this going to get out? If it's
Well, it's going to be on YouTube,
okay.
and then I'll write the book, and and a publisher will step forward, and and then it'll all go viral, and
Do you have plans to write a book?
I'd love to write a book, yes. I'd love to write many books. I'd love to be a sorry bookmaker working in the mines of truth, a pioneer.
Well, I feel what you've told us today, really, we could have done with a one-day workshop.
Well,
And-
I tell you, I've had to cut it, over and over and over. There's so much more that leads on from all this.
Well, I wish the Society would arrange a one-day workshop and get you back down here and try and get a bigger hall and a bigger audience.
I'd welcome that.
And
Yep.
certainly follow-ups anyway. With the last time you came was how many years ago?
It was 5 or 6 years
Yeah.
ago.
We need you back more often. But thank
you so
you.
much.
I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Lazarus P.O.
Yes, Lazarus.
Is that true? That's a truth. That it is Anthony Mundy.
As far as Scott, yes, there are some dissenting opinions, but he publishes a bunch of other books called Amadis de Gaul, or he translates
Amadis
de Gaul, they were like chivalric romances, if you like. They were kind of the precursor to Don Quixote in a way. They were very, very popular at the time in French, and they appeared in English in the early 1590s, translated by Lazarus Pio. Well, then they appear again in the 1618. Another edition of all these appears, again by Lazarus Pio, but this time Anthony Mundy takes credit for them. And so there's no question that at least in regard to these Amadis de Gaul books, it was Anthony Mundy. So that seems uncontroversial.
Right.
And there are other links between Mundy and Shakespeare and Mundy and
Well,
Bacon.
absolutely. I was going to say. I mean, we know that Mundy was very much involved with the creation of Shakespeare.
Well, that's right. The Sir Thomas More play is the classic one, where there's these 3 pages in Shakespeare's hand, in Shakespeare's ideas, and guess what? It's Francis Bacon's handwriting, and Anthony Mundy was the main writer of that play, and then these other collaborators, including Shakespeare, and that's a talk for another day. But that's something I actually would have loved to really go into, because that talks about the same issues. And the thing about that play was it was banned. They wrote the play and then they wouldn't permit it to be performed because it was way too controversial, because it was about London and it was about the riots.
You don't mean the other dogs?
No, I'm talking about, it's called The Book of Sir Thomas More. It was never performed, and it ended up turning up as it's one of the few manuscripts of plays that have ever been found. And it's famous because there's 3 pages of it, which orthodoxy accepts was written by Shakespeare because of the content of these 3 pages. First of all, it's superb. Secondly, it's full of allusions that show up in other Shakespeare plays. But there's also direct Baconian parallels in there, which are extraordinary. And it is in the handwriting of Bacon. And this is something that hasn't been done yet. But in fact, I've corresponded with Maureen Ward-Gandy, who is a leading criminal handwriting analyst in England, and she has given her preliminary opinion that it is indeed Francis Bacon's handwriting on these 3 pages. So there's a wonderful story to be told there. But there's the link between Anthony Mundy and Bacon at that time. So they were clearly working together. And in fact, in these other works of Mundy, he makes some fascinating comments in the introduction. He says, I was forced to do this by someone who I'm under authority to, or words to that effect. And he makes several comments about this, that he's doing it not because he wants to do, but because there's someone who tells him what to do, who told him to translate these works. And that's Bacon, and then hence Lazarus Pio and the 1596 book coming out smack at that time.
Can one get it? Oh.
Which one?
The Lazarus book.
Yes, I mean, Google them all and you'll find them. They're all there. Yep.
And another question.
Why did you choose The Merchant of Venice?
Well, I didn't actually. It's a funny thing because, I'd have to say in a funny way that it's not actually even really my favourite play, but by any means. I like it. It always leaves me with a slightly queasy feeling in my stomach at the end of the play, with the way Shylock's treated and everything. But if I had to name, my 5 favourite Bacon Shakespeare plays, it probably wouldn't be in there. But for whatever reason, like I say, one day I sort of sensed this Francis and Anthony thing, and once this pound of bacon idea had occurred to me, there was just no going back. It was just, I couldn't unthink the idea, because if this was occurring to these guys in their real life, their names were Bacon, they were borrowing money, they knew about the pound of flesh, it's inevitable. They thought of the joke, and the joke, they don't have to overlay anything. It's already there in their biography, so there's no real escaping it. I mean, they must have been just slapping their thighs, the two of them, and just...
Would you consider doing another one?
I'm sorry?
Would you consider investigating another?
Well, I have, yes, Yeah.